It was just another ordinary day on Earth, people going about their routines, unaware of the storm approaching from the farthest reaches of space. The sky above was clear, the sun shone brightly, and the streets were bustling with life. No one could have predicted that this calm, peaceful world was about to be shaken to its very core. The first strange signal was detected by a group of astronomers working late into the night. At first they thought it was a glitch, a random burst of noise that could be easily dismissed. But when the signal repeated itself, the astronomers started to feel something was off. The signal wasn't just random. It was deliberate, structured. It seemed like someone, or something, was trying to communicate. Dr. Emily Walker, a leading expert in alien communications, was the first to notice the pattern. The signal came from deep space, far beyond where human technology had ever reached. It wasn't like anything the team had ever seen before. The message, encoded in a complex series of beeps and bursts, didn't make any sense at first. It seemed like an intricate puzzle, but something about the frequency and the way it was structured made Emily uneasy. "Is this a message?" she muttered to herself, staring at the monitor in front of her. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, trying to decode the message. As the words slowly started to take shape, a chilling realization spread across her face. The message was no longer just an intriguing mystery, it was a clear communication from an intelligence far beyond Earth's understanding. The first part of the message was a mockery. It read, "Your efforts are futile. You cannot understand what you hear. We have watched you for eons, and you are not ready." It was cold, impersonal, and arrogant. Emily sat back in her chair, her eyes wide. The message wasn't just from any unknown source, it was from someone who seemed to know about Earth, who knew about humanity, and who seemed to be deliberately taunting them. Word spread through the scientific community. The world's leaders took notice. The tone of the message was clear. This was no simple alien greeting. It was a challenge, a warning, and a threat all at once. They had seen humanity's advances, and yet they believed humanity was still not worthy of their attention. The arrogance in the message was palpable, and it sent chills down the spine of every person who heard it. Media outlets picked up the story, and soon it was all over the news. People all over the world were gripped with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Were these aliens? What did they want? And why were they so confident, so sure that they could mock humanity with such disdain? But it didn't stop there. A second message came shortly after, this time with more clarity and a chilling finality. The message read, "We are the You have no place in the universe. Your existence is insignificant to us. You are merely ants beneath our feet, crawling, scrambling, thinking you matter. Soon, you will understand the true power of our fleet, the Draconians." The name sent a wave of fear across the globe. No one had ever heard of them before, and yet here they were, announcing their superiority. The arrogance in their words was unmistakable. They didn't even see humanity as a threat. They saw humans as nothing more than a speck, something to be wiped away without a second thought. The world's leaders scrambled to react. Military bases were placed on high alert, and scientists worked around the clock, trying to decode the message further. But no matter how hard they tried, the technology of the Draconians was far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. The messages were just the beginning. In the following days, the signals grew stronger, more detailed, and they seemed to be a constant reminder that Earth was being watched. As the days passed, fear began to take hold of the population. People wondered if they would even survive long enough to understand what the Draconians truly wanted. But even more chilling was the realization that the Draconians had been watching humanity for much longer than they could have imagined, had seen Earth grow, seen humanity's progress, and now they were ready to make their move. And then came the third message, the one that truly shook the world to its core. This one wasn't just a warning, it was a direct challenge to humanity's very existence. The message simply read, "Prepare yourselves. Your mockery ends here." It was almost as if the Draconians had been waiting for this moment, watching as humanity slowly advanced, knowing full well that they would never be able to match the superior power of the Draconian fleet. The tone was no longer mocking. It was cold and final, as though the Draconians had already made their decision. There would be no mercy, no negotiation. Earth would pay the price for daring to challenge them, for believing that humanity was somehow worthy of being in the same universe as the Draconians. The world was plunged into chaos. Leaders of nations made frantic calls to each other, trying to prepare for the worst. But deep down, everyone knew that the Draconians were too powerful, too advanced. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. And then, the silence descended. For a brief moment, There was no communication, no signals, no messages. It was as if the Draconians were waiting for something. The world held its breath. No one knew when the fleet would arrive, or how soon the end would come. The uncertainty and dread grew, and humanity was left in a state of paralyzing fear. Mocking had begun, and now, the real terror was about to unfold. The first signal was just the beginning. A subtle shift in the air, an unspoken tension that no one could quite place. It started with those eerie messages, mocking humanity's pride. Yet, as the world trembled under the weight of those words, no one could have prepared for what would come next. The global response was immediate. Military forces from every nation were put on high alert, weapons systems activated, satellites scrambled to capture every minute change in the sky. Governments met in frantic discussions, offering no clear solutions, only fear. Scientists worked tirelessly to decode the signals, but each new discovery seemed to reveal more and more of humanity's helplessness. Nothing made sense. Nothing seemed to offer a way out. Dr. Emily Walker and her team continued their efforts. But as the days passed, their hope waned. The messages were just the start. The fear, though, was tangible. People could sense it in the air, the kind of fear that grips your chest and paralyzes your every movement. It was more than just the unknown. It was the quiet certainty that something far more powerful than humanity was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Then came the radio silence. At first it felt like a brief respite. People dared to hope perhaps the Draconians had lost interest, or perhaps they had overestimated the situation. For a few fleeting days, there were no new messages, no strange signals, no mocking words. But then, without warning, everything changed. On a calm morning, when the world seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, the skies above Earth darkened. The first to notice it were astronomers who observed something far off in the distance, a flicker in the starfield, growing closer with each passing hour. It wasn't just a comet or an asteroid, it was a massive formation, unlike anything seen before. The object moved with purpose, with precision. It was as if it was guided by an unseen hand, driven by something far beyond the understanding of Earth's greatest minds. Panic spread like wildfire as the world watched in real time. Those who had once hoped that the Draconians were nothing more than a prank or a bluff now realized just how wrong they had been. The ships, those gargantuan vessels, came into view. They were silent, so silent that their approach felt more like an oppressive weight pressing down on the earth. There was no hum, no rumble, no sign of their arrival other than the cold presence they radiated. It was then that humanity realized how little it had truly known about the universe. The technology they had once thought of as cutting edge, the weapons they had trusted to protect them, were nothing compared to what was now approaching. Earth had always believed that it was at the top of the food chain, that it was special, that somehow, the rest of the universe had been waiting for humanity to catch up. But now, standing at the edge of oblivion, they understood the terrible truth. Earth was nothing more than a small, insignificant dot in a vast, uncaring universe. The Draconian Fleet did not arrive with a loud roar or a devastating blast. They didn't announce their presence with flashy explosions or grand gestures. No, they arrived quietly, with an eerie calm that left the world trembling in confusion. Their ships were sleek, dark, and angular, adorned with glowing symbols that pulsed with a sinister light. The sheer size of them was enough to dwarf the largest human-made spacecraft. It was clear humanity was facing something far more advanced than it had ever imagined. The fleet's arrival was like a silent storm. There were no trumpets of war, no cries of conquest. It was as if they didn't need to announce their superiority. Their very presence was enough to strike fear into the hearts of everyone on Earth. As the ships moved closer, the world's defense systems were activated. Every satellite was positioned, every missile defense system was ready, and every radar scanned the skies. But as the first wave of missiles was launched, a strange thing happened. They didn't hit. They didn't even get close. Something in the atmosphere distorted their paths, redirected their energy, and the weapons fell harmlessly into space. The Earth's best technology, its most advanced weapons, had been completely neutralized. The Draconian Fleet didn't fight back. They didn't need to. Their power wasn't in their weapons, but in their sheer technological superiority. The missiles were gone before they could even reach their targets, vanishing into the emptiness of space without a trace. The world watched in stunned silence as Earth's defenses crumbled before their eyes. The realization was horrifying. There was no way to stop them. There was no chance of winning. In the face of such overwhelming power, the world's leaders were left in disarray. Panic spread across the globe. Governments fell apart as they tried to make sense of what was happening. The idea of resistance, once a bold thought, now seemed foolish. The Draconians had already made their move, and they were not here to negotiate or seek alliances. They were here to show humanity its place in the grand scheme of things, a place that didn't matter at all, that as the fleet hovered above the earth, its ships arranged in a perfect formation. The mocking message from the Draconians reverberated once again through every communication channel. "You mocked us," it said. "Now you will learn the consequences of your arrogance." The words were clear, and they were accompanied by a horrifying silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any sound. The kind of silence that makes you feel small, insignificant, and powerless. The fleet didn't attack immediately. No explosions, no lasers, no weapons fire. They simply watched. They observed. The silence was maddening, and with each passing moment, the sense of dread grew heavier. Was this the beginning of the end? Was humanity doomed to be erased without even a chance to fight back? It was then, in that chilling silence, that the true weight of the Draconian fleet's arrival hit home. This wasn't a battle, this was something far worse. The mockery had just begun, and the Draconians weren't in a hurry to finish it. The world could do nothing but wait, and in that wait, the true horror began to sink in. The weight of the Draconian fleet's presence in the sky was unbearable. Earth had never felt so small, so vulnerable. There was no dramatic thunder, no fiery weapons soaring across the sky. No great battle cries. There was just the eerie silence. As the fleet loomed overhead, blocking out the stars and casting an unnatural shadow over the planet below, humanity was paralyzed, caught between disbelief and terror. The world had never seen anything like this. Governments were still scrambling to make sense of the situation. The military's greatest minds, once confident in their ability to defend Earth from any threat, were now helpless. High-tech satellites that once allowed Earth to monitor every corner of the planet now failed in the face of the Draconians' silent dominance. Radar systems were useless, communication scrambled, and humanity's most advanced weapons, its last line of defense, were rendered useless without a single shot being fired. Every military leader felt the crushing weight of their impotence. Watching as the impossible became undeniable, the Draconian ships glided gracefully, moving in perfect unison, their sleek, dark forms casting long shadows over the cities below. There were no flashes of light, no roaring engines, just the quiet, deliberate movement of enormous vessels across the atmosphere. Each ship was a fortress, a cold and calculating behemoth that seemed to absorb the very energy around it. It wasn't just their size that was overwhelming. It was their silence. The Draconians didn't need to declare their intentions. They didn't need to warn humanity with grand gestures. Their ships spoke louder than any weapon ever could. The message was clear: you are insignificant. For those on the ground, it felt as though time itself had slowed. People wandered the streets, their eyes turned skyward, captivated by the shadow that stretched across their homes. Fear was tangible in the air. Parents clutched their children, trying to shield them from something they couldn't even understand. Some gathered in the streets, praying. Others locked themselves indoors, too afraid to even look outside. And all the while, the fleet hovered above, watching, waiting. Humanity didn't know what would happen next, but everyone feared it wouldn't be good. And then, without warning, the world's first true confrontation with the Draconians occurred. It came not in the form of a sudden attack, but as an eerie, quiet demonstration of power. One of the Draconian ships lowered itself into Earth's orbit, its engines humming with an unnatural hum that seemed to reverberate through the very air itself. It was a sound so faint, it almost seemed like a whisper. And yet, the moment it happened, every person on Earth felt a tan, unmistakable pressure, as though the very atmosphere had changed. Then, as if to emphasize their dominance, the Drac did something that further crushed humanity's already shattered confidence. They sent a single, unarmed drone, an object no larger than a card, onto Earth. It descended slowly, almost mockingly, cutting through the sky with ease. The ground beneath it seemed to shake as it approached, as though the Earth itself was reacting to its presence. It landed in the center of a major city, without causing so much as a crack in the ground. The moment it touched the surface, a chilling voice echoed from the drone speakers, though no one could explain how. "You mocked us," the voice said, its tone cold and emotionless. "Now you will learn your place." There was no explosion, no destruction, just the silence after those words. The drone remained there, motionless, as if waiting for humanity's next move. The entire world was frozen, as if holding its breath. What did the Draconians want? Why were they toying with Earth in this way? Was this just a game for them, a demonstration of power to show Earth's inferiority? Or was something far worse? coming. The world's military leaders were on edge, preparing for the worst, unsure of what might happen next. Was this the beginning of the end? Was Earth truly so powerless against an enemy that didn't even need to fire a single shot to render it helpless? The tension was suffocating, and it felt like the entire world was teetering on the edge of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Meanwhile, the Draconian fleet continued to hover above, completely undisturbed by the chaos they had created below. There were no signs of hostility, no lasers, no missiles, but the fear was overwhelming. The silence between the fleet and Earth was deafening. The contrast between the Draconians' eerie calm and humanity's frantic panic couldn't have been more striking. Days turned into weeks, and still, nothing seemed to change. The Draconians had made their presence known, and they hadn't made a move to strike. But each passing moment weighed heavily on the hearts of those who still clung to hope. The uncertainty was unbearable. Would they finally make their move? Would they show no mercy, wiping out all of humanity in an instant? The people of Earth were left with only one certainty. There was no longer any such thing as security. Their once proud world, brimming with life and activity, now felt like a fragile, helpless thing, subject to the whims of a force far beyond its reach. It wasn't just the fear of being obliterated that plagued their minds, it was the knowledge that Earth had been judged and found lacking. The mocking had only just begun, and the silence that followed was louder than anything the world had ever known. In the hearts of the people, something dark began to grow. Fear turned to dread, and dread turned to something worse: acceptance. The Draconians were not here to negotiate. They were not here to conquer. They were here to remind Earth of its place, to erase any illusion of superiority. And as the fleet continued to hover in the sky, humanity could do nothing but watch. They were nothing more than witnesses to a force that had long since decided their fate. And still, the silence remained. The Draconians didn't need to speak. Their actions had already said everything that needed to be said. The days after the Draconians' arrival felt like a slow, suffocating march toward an inevitable end. Earth had been left in a strange limbo, caught between the terror of the unknown and the paralyzing realization that there was no way to escape what was coming. The world's greatest minds were still scrambling for answers, but every attempt at resistance seemed more futile than the last. Humanity's best technology was useless against the fleet that hovered above them, casting a shadow over the planet that no one could escape. But in the midst of all this chaos, a single figure emerged from the depths of Earth's darkest corners. Dr. Emily Walker, once a quiet and determined scientist, had become the world's reluctant symbol of hope. Her team had spent days locked in a lab, studying every signal, every piece of data they had gathered about the Draconians. Emily's mind was sharp, but the weight of what was happening had begun to take its toll. It was not just the fear for her own life, it was the fear of what would happen to every person she had ever known. As she sat in front of the vast array of monitors in the underground facility, a strange thought began to creep into her mind. The Draconians weren't just attacking, they were waiting. They had made their presence known, but they hadn't struck with full force. There was something almost deliberate about their restraint. Why had they not obliterated Earth yet? What were they waiting for? Her thoughts were interrupted by a message from the Global Council, a desperate plea for answers. Leaders from every corner of the Earth were reaching out, unable to understand the true nature of the threat. They were ready to do whatever it took to defend their world, but they lacked the knowledge of how to fight something that didn't even seem to fight in the traditional sense. Emily stood up, pacing the lab. A gut feeling pulled at her, a sense that she had missed something crucial. The Draconians were too controlled, too calculated. They had demonstrated their superiority in ways that weren't just about power. They were toying with humanity, drawing out the fear, building the suspense before the inevitable strike. It was as if they were savoring the moment before the final blow. But then, something unexpected happened. A new signal came through. At first, it was so faint that Emily thought it was another glitch, a random anomaly. But as she studied it further, she realized it was another message from the Draconians. This time, it wasn't the mocking tone she had grown used to. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a command. It was an offer, a challenge. "Test your weapon," the message said, the words echoing in her mind. "If you dare." The words hung in the air, both chilling and strange. Emily's heart raced as she processed the meaning behind them. Was this an opportunity? Was this the moment that the Draconians were offering humanity a chance to fight back? Or was it another trap, designed to test humanity's desperation? The Draconians were always 2 steps ahead, but this felt different. There was something subtle about it, a flicker of possibility in the midst of all the hopelessness. Emily knew what she had to do. It was time for humanity to act. But what weapon could they possibly use? What could they hope to accomplish against a fleet that could erase entire cities with a single glance? In the chaos of the past few days, the world's military forces had been working on a secret project, an experimental weapon designed to counter the advanced technology they had no hope of understanding, let alone defeating. The weapon was humanity's last hope. It was a radical concept, something that had been developed in secret for years under the tightest security, hidden from even the highest levels of government. It wasn't just a physical weapon, it was something much more intricate. The idea behind it was simply using human ingenuity. Earth's scientists had developed a device that could potentially disrupt the Draconians' advanced technology, at least for a moment. A moment, Emily thought, was all they needed. The weapon was not something that could be launched from a missile silo or activated by a push of a button. It was a living thing, born from the collective knowledge and experience of Earth's greatest minds. Emily had worked on it herself, but she had never truly believed it would be necessary until now. The Global Council, after hearing her plea, gave their reluctant approval. Time was running out. They had no choice but to act. The weapon would be tested against the Draconians themselves. As the countdown began, a sense of dread filled the air. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The weapon would be launched in an effort to trigger a reaction, a spark, anything that could offer a glimpse of hope. The silence of the Draconian fleet remained deafening, and the uncertainty of whether this weapon would even have any effect loomed over them all. But there was no turning back now. The countdown ticked closer to zero, and Earth held its breath. When the moment finally came, the weapon was activated. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The world watched, waiting for some sign of change. Had the Draconians seen the weapon for what it was? Had they prepared for such an attempt? The seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, and then, something strange occurred. The Draconian fleet, which had been motionless, suddenly shifted. It was subtle at first, like a ripple across the surface of water. The ships began to realign, their once perfect formation disturbed, if only for an instant. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. The fleet was reacting. It was small, but it was a reaction nonetheless. They hadn't anticipated it. The weapon had done something, no matter how minute. It had disrupted their calm. They hadn't wiped it out immediately. It was as if they were waiting. For the first time since the Draconians had appeared, Emily felt something stirring deep within her, a spark of hope. The weapon hadn't defeated them, it hadn't broken their hold on Earth, but it had proven something crucial. Humanity wasn't entirely helpless. The fight wasn't over yet. As the fleet reformed its position, Emily knew the real battle had only just begun. But for the first time, she could see a glimmer of possibility. The Draconians had underestimated humanity, and that mistake might just be their downfall. For the first time since the Draconians had arrived, Earth found a fleeting moment of hope. It was as if the universe had paused, waiting for the next move. The weapon had done something, however small, but in a world consumed by silence and dread, even the slightest flicker of resistance felt like a victory. Yet, that fleeting moment was quickly replaced by an unsettling stillness, the kind that felt as though something was about to shift. Something far darker than anything humanity had yet experienced. As the days passed, the brief reaction from the Draconian fleet faded into the background. The ships in the sky continued their slow, deliberate movements, an almost ghostly dance above the cities and landscapes below. They hadn't made any overt moves to attack, but there was something undeniably ominous about the way they watched. Every movement, every action seemed calculated, like a predator toying with its prey before delivering the final, inevitable strike. The world had been forced to adapt to the terrifying presence above. Life carried on, but it was no longer normal. People stayed indoors, avoided looking up, and tried to pretend their world wasn't slowly being encircled by a force that they could neither comprehend nor defeat. Governments, in their desperation, continued to prepare for an attack that seemed inevitable. Military forces remained on high alert, but the sense of hopelessness was palpable. They had no idea what they were up against. The Draconians weren't just aliens. They were an unknowable force with technology that made Earth's most advanced weapons look like toys. Then, out of nowhere, a single transmission crackled through every communication channel. At first, it was so faint that it was almost imperceptible, like a whisper on the edge of consciousness. But it didn't take long for the message to become clear. The voice was cold, distant, and without emotion. "We have watched you," it said. "We have studied your species and your weaknesses. You will never be enough." The voice was unmistakably Draconian, and the words carried an eerie finality. But this wasn't the same mocking tone that had echoed across Earth's communications before. This was different, almost personal. There was a subtle shift in the nature of their interaction with humanity, and it wasn't lost on the people who heard it. The Draconians were no longer just observing, they were calculating, waiting, perhaps even preparing. At first, the response was confusion. What did this new message mean? Had the Draconians finally decided to wipe humanity out? Or was this something else entirely? Scientists scrambled to decipher any hidden meaning, but no one could make sense of it. The message was too vague, too ambiguous. It was an invitation of sorts, yet one laced with a chilling promise. Humanity was no closer to understanding the Draconians than it had been on the first day their fleet appeared. There had been no battle, no bombastic gestures of aggression, just a slow, deliberate encroachment, as though the Draconians were playing some long game, drawing out the terror with surgical precision. It was like being watched by a force that existed outside of time itself, a presence that didn't care about the trivialities of earthly life. As the days turned to weeks, the tension only increased. People continued to go about their daily routines, but everything felt wrong. It was as though the whole world had been turned upside down, and they were all just waiting for the final act of a play they didn't understand. Every glance at the sky brought a sinking feeling in the stomach. Every transmission from the fleet made the heart race. The questions began to gnaw at humanity's collective consciousness. What did the Draconians want? And more importantly, what was going to happen when they finally decided to act? Then, without warning, a massive, terrifying event took place. One of the Draconian ships, the largest of them all, began to descend slowly toward Earth. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't just another shadow against the backdrop of the sky. This ship was different, bigger, more menacing. The air itself seemed to bend around it, as if the laws of nature were bowing to its presence. The ship's descent was a slow, deliberate process. It didn't fall like a comet or rocket. It floated down with unnerving grace, until it hovered just above Earth's surface. The world held its breath. People gathered in the streets, staring up at the enormous ship, unable to look away. It seemed to draw all the light from around it, casting a dark, foreboding shadow over everything below. There was no sound, just a heavy weight of anticipation in the air. Then, for the first time, something unexpected happened. The ship's immense bulk shimmered for a moment, and a series of sharp, blinding lights blinked on its surface. A strange, pulsating hum filled the air, echoing across the globe. But instead of weapons or destruction, the ship's lights seemed to communicate. They flickered in a pattern, one that mirrored the signals humanity had received from the Draconians all along. It was as if the ship was speaking a language that could be understood by no one. It was the first time the Draconians had done anything other than observe in complete silence. The world's greatest mind scientists, linguists, and engineers rushed to make sense of it. They had to act quickly. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The Draconians were no longer just watching. They were revealing something, and humanity had to decipher it before it was too late. It wasn't just the shape of the ship that was imposing, it was its very presence. Every second it hovered over the Earth felt like an eternity. The very air seemed to tremble under the weight of it. Humanity had never been this close to the unknown, never this close to something so beyond their understanding. But even as the world's brightest minds worked tirelessly to decode the ship's signals, a chilling realization began to spread. The Draconians weren't concerned with humanity's response. They weren't seeking to conquer or destroy. What they wanted was far more unsettling. The Draconians weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to battle. They were here to erase everything humanity had built, everything it had ever known, everything that Earth thought it could rely on. This wasn't the beginning of a war. It was the beginning of the end. Humanity's final test had begun, and no one knew how it would play out. Every move from here on out would determine Earth's fate, and the Draconians were the ones who held all the cards. The world stood on the precipice of something unimaginable. The looming presence of the Draconian fleet was no longer just a frightening shadow. It had become a suffocating reality that the entire planet was helpless against. Each day that passed under their watchful gaze brought more uncertainty, more fear. The silent, relentless invasion was no longer about force, it was about presence. The Draconians weren't just here to conquer, they were here to make an example of Earth, to show the galaxy how insignificant humanity truly was. And for the first time, Earth began to feel it deep in its bones. Every attempt to fight back had ended in failure. Every defensive measure easily crushed by the overwhelming power of the Draconian technology. The fleet had descended into Earth's atmosphere, hanging over the planet like a dark cloud, almost waiting for humanity to make its next move. But there was no real choice anymore. The weapons were useless. The human resolve, once so certain, had begun to crack. For those few who still held on to hope, the ship that had descended larger than any they had ever seen was a cruel reminder of how outmatched they were. Its pulsing lights, shimmering as if alive, were not a display of power but a signal. It was a message in a language that humanity couldn't yet understand but felt in their very souls. The air around them seemed to hum with its presence, and every man, woman, and child could feel it, a low, oppressive weight that pressed down on their chests, making each breath feel like a struggle. Then, as if to prove that the human race truly had no place in this new reality, the Draconians sent one final, unmistakable message. It wasn't a direct threat. It wasn't a challenge or a show of force. It was something far worse, an invitation to surrender. The message crackled across every screen on Earth, from television broadcasts to personal devices. It was chilling, not because of the words themselves, but because of the calm, unfeeling tone in which they were spoken. You have made your attempts, they were futile. You are insignificant, do not resist, surrender, and your suffering will end. And with those words, the true weight of what humanity was facing sank in. There would be no grand battle, no last-minute heroics, no nuclear strike or last-ditch effort to push back the invading force. The Draconians had already made their decision. They had no interest in destroying humanity with explosions or fiery blasts. Instead, they would erase Earth without a sound. Humanity wasn't being destroyed in the way people had imagined. There was no great war, no sudden flash of light that consumed the planet. There was simply ... silence. The ships above remained still, suspended in space, unmoving, unyielding. The tension built, thick and oppressive, as the whole world waited for something, anything, to break the suffocating stillness. It was as if the Draconians were giving Earth one last chance to respond, and yet there was nothing anyone could do. The world's leaders scrambled for answers that never came. They made desperate calls to one another, but all their words fell flat. There was nothing left to do but wait. The silence stretched on, and in that silence, the true horror began to settle in. People everywhere began to notice it. The world wasn't just waiting for the Draconians to strike. The world was already changing. The atmosphere seemed thicker, the sky darker, and a sense of unease crept into every street, every home. The usual hum of life, the sounds of traffic, of everyday noise, slowly began to fade away. People grew restless, uncertain of what they should be doing, as if they could feel the ground shifting beneath them. News outlets began to report strange occurrences. Electrical grids flickered, and power outages became more frequent. Communications between countries and even within cities became increasingly disjointed, like the entire planet was losing its coherence. The streets that had once been filled with bustling crowds now felt eerily empty, the absence of life hanging in the air like a thick fog. Fear was no longer just a reaction to the unknown. It had become the world's new reality. Even nature seemed to respond. Birds stopped singing. The winds grew still. It was as if Earth itself had been forced into a temporary stasis, suspended in time, awaiting the inevitable. No one knew what to do with themselves. The weapons, the strategies, the defenses, none of it mattered. The Draconians had already won. Earth was a canvas upon which they would soon paint the final stroke. And still, the fleet remained silent. Done without warning, the Draconian ships began to move again. Slowly, methodically, they shifted position in the sky. There was no announcement, no warning. They simply rearranged themselves, as if the silence had been a prelude, a way of heightening the tension before the final act. The people on the ground watched helplessly, some even dropping to their knees, not knowing what the next move would bring. And in that moment, as the ships continued their slow, deliberate movements, something in the distance began to shift. A new wave of dread filled the air, thicker and more intense than anything before. A ripple of energy seemed to surge through the atmosphere, as though the Draconians were preparing to unleash something far more powerful than anyone could comprehend. The entire planet felt it. A deep, resonating hum of vibration that seemed to echo from the very core of the Earth. The ships aligned, their formation more precise than ever before. They had done nothing for so long. Now they were ready to act. And the world was still frozen in fear. Humanity had done its best to resist, but it was clear now. The Draconians were not interested in a drawn-out war. They had no need to destroy Earth with violence. They would erase it quietly, without so much as a sound. The humans had nothing left to fight with, and now, they had nothing left to lose. And just like that, the planet seemed to hold its breath. The world had done everything it could, but Earth was no longer its own. It was no longer a home to its people. It was the Draconians to take, whenever they decided it was time to do so. The silence continued, and all humanity could do was wait for the end. As the silence hung over the Earth like a suffocating blanket, something inexplicable began to shift. The days that had passed since the Draconians' arrival were not just an invasion, they had become a slow, agonizing countdown. Humanity, once full of ambition and hope, was now reduced to a planet waiting for its erasure. The fleet loomed overhead, but their silence spoke volumes, louder than any weapon ever could. There was no grand final battle, no desperate last stand. It was all leading to this moment, a moment that would define Earth's place in the vast universe. Yet, amidst this crushing weight, something unexpected happened. A strange signal, a crackling, distorted frequency began to emerge from the depths of the Earth's communications grid. It wasn't the smooth, cold efficiency of the Draconian messages. This was different. This was human. The message was faint, breaking up every few words, but it was unmistakably from something on Earth, a signal from a place no one expected. In the depths of the underground facility where the Draconians' first challenges had been analyzed, a group of scientists had continued their work, despite the odds. These were the few who refused to accept that humanity's future had already been written. It was clear that Earth's best military and technological minds had failed to breach the Draconian defenses. But one question remained unanswered. If they were fighting the wrong battle, what if the real solution didn't lie in weapons, but in humanity's own untapped potential? Dr. Emily Walker was at the forefront of the breakthrough. She'd been working tirelessly with her team on a strange artifact discovered years ago, a relic of Earth's forgotten past, a puzzle that seemed to resist every attempt at understanding. But as the Draconians' presence grew more oppressive, something inside her clicked. The artifact wasn't a tool of war. It was something much older, something that had once belonged to a civilization that had fallen long before humanity had learned to stand. What had seemed like a historical curiosity had now become the last hope. The relic was in fact a conduit, a bridge to something the Draconians couldn't foresee, something beyond the reach of their technological superiority. With trembling hands, Emily activated the artifact. At first there was nothing, then a low hum reverberated from the core of the device, and the room began to shake. The lights flickered, and the very walls seemed to pulse with energy. There was a moment of confusion, followed by a sudden, sharp clarity. The signal wasn't just a call for help, it was an invitation to something that the Draconians could never understand. This wasn't a weapon. This was a human response to the threat they posed, a deep, primal connection to something older than the stars themselves. Emily's eyes widened as she understood what she had unlocked. This artifact wasn't just technology, it was a record of a forgotten truth. It was proof that humanity wasn't alone in the universe, not just because of the Draconians, but because there had once been others who had transcended what the Draconians had become. It was a key, an ancient truth that could shift the balance of power, if only humanity could find the courage to use it. And in that moment of clarity, the world began to change. The Draconian fleet remained silent, hovering in place, but their once perfect formations began to waver. It was subtle at first, like the slightest ripple across an undisturbed surface, but it grew. The ships, which had once appeared invincible, now seemed to falter, as if they were being pulled in a direction they hadn't anticipated. Their flawless coordination broke apart, and an odd hum began to emanate from the fleet, as if they were reacting to something unknown. Back on Earth, the world's population was in a state of utter disbelief. The tension had been building for so long, and now, in the midst of the overwhelming silence, something seemed to be shifting. People stared at the sky, uncertain of what they were witnessing. Was it an attack, a sign of retreat, or was it something else entirely? The air was thick with anticipation. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the Draconian fleet, every mind racing to understand what was happening. And then it became clear the Draconians, so sure of their superiority, were reacting to the artifact. It was humanity's secret weapon. The Draconians hadn't anticipated. The balance had tipped, but not in the way anyone had expected. The Draconians were no longer the overwhelming force in this struggle. They were no longer sure of their next move. Emily watched as the signal she had uncovered pulsed in rhythm with the shifts in the Draconian fleet. Her heart raced as she understood what was at stake. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for a chance to rewrite history, to break free from the chains the Draconians had imposed on humanity's destiny. Then, for the first time since the fleet had arrived, the Draconians spoke. But it was not with the cold, mocking tone that had characterized their messages. It was a strange, trembling voice, a sign of hesitation, of uncertainty. "Something we did not expect," the voice said, its words crackling across the airwaves. "Your species is different. You are not like the others." It was the first time the Draconians had acknowledged humanity as more than insignificant, and it sent ripples across the world. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't the silence of doom, it was the silence of something shifting, something giving way. As Emily looked up, a feeling she hadn't experienced since the Draconians had first appeared washed over her. Not a false hope, not a desperate grasp at straws, but a real, tangible belief that humanity might just have a chance after all. The Draconians were not invincible. Their arrogance had blinded them to the potential of the very species they had mocked. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, humanity wasn't fighting alone. And as the Draconian fleet began to regroup, as if questioning their very purpose on Earth, Emily knew one thing for certain: the human spirit was not something that could be erased, not by technology, not by superiority, and certainly not by silence. The real battle had just begun. But now, for the first time, humanity was fighting on its own terms.